Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're very pleased that you could be with us here today. For those of you that were coming to the Cinco de Mayo party, this is not it. It is, however, Cinco de Mayo. This is rather a rather topical issue on the current outbreak of flu, H1N1 flu, sometimes called swine flu, that offends our friends in the pig farming business. But such it has been baptized in the press. This is an issue that for CSIS and the Wilson Center working together on this, we thought was important to do something now while it's still a major issue. I'm sure there'll be time to sit back and think after the current crisis has passed about what's going on, but it was important to get timely information out there. We had a conversation really just a few days ago, actually, about this and thought it was very important to put this together. Let me recognize Joanna Mendelson, who couldn't be with us but was instrumental in putting this together from the Americas program at CSIS, as well as Kitty Putnam, who's over in the corner or may have just stepped out, Kitty's right there, who did most of the work on our end in putting this together. Very pleased that you could join us for a conversation both about what's going on. We'll hear from Dr. Barbosa in a little bit about that, what's going on in terms of the epidemiology, what we should expect. Is this coming back again? I think there's some unknowns but very important questions. But also, as we'll hear from Dr. Catherine Bliss in a moment, what's been going on in terms of cooperation in the Americas. I think one of the things that's come out from this experience is seeing that, in fact, there are rapid response mechanisms in the hemisphere. Some of what we've seen in terms of collaboration in North America, among Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We've been preparing for this together for the past few years. Has turned out to be very effective, and we've been able to respond perhaps quicker than one might have expected, and that's perhaps extending to the hemisphere and internationally as well. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Gib, who runs our Global Health Initiative here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and knows much more about this than I do. And I'm Andrew Seeley from the Mexico Institute, by the way. Gib.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew said, my name is Gib Clark. I'm the coordinator of our Global Health Initiative here at the Wilson Center. Just quickly about the Global Health Initiative, it's a newer program here at the center that was sort of designed by the board to do things just like this, to recognize that all of the center's programs do health now and again. And so we bring everything all under one tent, but we also focus specifically on maternal health financing, and health in post-conflict and post-disaster settings. Really looking forward to today's event. As I was telling Andrew and a few others, I've enjoyed putting this event together because I've found that it's taught me a lot about what's happening, that so much happening so quickly, it's easy to lose track of the course of the virus and where it's projected to go in the future. So we have two people who know a lot about it who will be telling us both about the epidemiological but also the political side of things. I'll tell you briefly a little bit about our speakers, but the bios are available outside for much more information. First, we're going to hear from Catherine Bliss, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she heads up their Americas program there. Before joining the Americas program, she was a Foreign Affairs Officer at the Department of State, as she focused on global health and the Western Hemisphere in the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, and received the Superior Honor Award for her work on environmental health. We'll next hear from Jarbas Barbosa. He is the Area Manager for Health Surveillance and Disease Management at PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization. He is a Brazilian national and received his medical degrees from the Federal University of Pernambuco and studied public health and epidemiology at Osvaldo Cruz Foundation. After our two presentations, we'll have time for questions and answer. My only request is that you wait for a microphone to come around as we are webcasting this event so that our folks at home can follow along. So I'll stop there and turn things over to Catherine.
Thank you. Do I need to? It should be on?
You don't need to be too close.
All right. Well, thank you, Gib and Andrew. Thank you to the Wilson Center for the Mexico Institute and the Global Health Program for hosting this event. I just thought that I would provide a little bit of background and discuss, to some extent, sort of the political, economic, and social context of the outbreak in Mexico and the collaboration within the North American context. Say something about the larger international context of some of the preparedness that has taken shape over the past number of years, And I know that Dr. Barbosa is going to provide much more of the scientific background and information, so I will confine myself to the other issues. Just to kind of say up front, the right to health is enshrined in Mexico's Constitution of 1917, and Mexico has made significant progress in strengthening its health system and reaching underserved communities in recent years through a variety of programs, the conditional cash transfer programs, popular insurance for people not covered through the private sector or through the state sector. But gaps remain, especially in remote and sort of underserved areas that can, in some cases, make surveillance a challenge. After the outbreak was announced, President Felipe Calderon invoked emergency powers, authorizing the government to scale up its quarantine and isolation measures, as well as giving it the authority to inspect homes and other spaces as appropriate and as necessary. On April 26th, the government closed schools in Mexico City. On the 27th, schools across the nation were closed, affecting about 33 million students. Federal offices and non-essential federal personnel have been off work over May 1st through 5th, which is the long holiday weekend. So that was something that was anticipated in any event, but that coincides with the larger closure of some of the offices. Restaurants in Mexico City were advised to provide takeout service only in response to the outbreak. Discotheques, bars, nightclubs closed until further notice. The health ministry has stepped up communications, instructing people how to protect themselves, to practice appropriate hygiene, hand washing, and to stay home and seek medical help if they are sick. Mobile clinics have been mobilized to provide access to people in remote or underserved areas, and the Army was mobilized to distribute at least 6 million face masks. So the response over the last week or so, sometimes it's hard to remember that this has only been going on a fairly short period of time, but there have been a number of measures taken. In terms of the political context, it's important to understand that in Mexico, the government is currently involved in an intense campaign against organized crime, especially in states in the north along the U.S.-Mexican border. So, this is something else that's going on in addition to dealing with this outbreak. Mexico also has midterm congressional elections coming up on July 5th, and political campaigns are starting to get underway. With the sanitary alert and in the context of the outbreak, there have been restrictions on public gatherings, which have, in some cases, forced candidates to sort of cancel or postpone launches of their campaigns. And in Congress, there have been some calls for rethinking some of the approaches to public health. Some people have started questioning whether Mexico may need some kind of new agency to kind of oversee these sort of threats at the national level, and talking about bolstering the public health capacity and investigation capacity within the Ministry of the Health. With respect to the economic context, it's important to remember that before the outbreak, Mexico was already being hard hit by the financial crisis. Demand for consumer products was down. Remittances from migrants living abroad has been down. At the same time, reduced oil production has led to lower levels of funding for social programs through the budget in Mexico. Now, in response to the outbreak, some countries have banned or suspended travel to Mexico, and I think that includes Argentina, Cuba, China, Ecuador, and Peru, or at least suspended travel. Other people are canceling travel plans, and this brings tourism, which is a key economic driver in the country, to a considerable slowdown. And some people have said that estimates of losses with respect to tourism are around $2.3 billion, which is significant. At least 9 major conferences are estimated to have been canceled, 15 postponed. I think about 10% of tours have been canceled, and some estimates say that at least 5,500 visitors who otherwise would have visited Mexico are not going or not attending those tours during this process. So at the state level, a group of governors have called for an action plan to address the economic implications of the outbreak and to repair the image associated with the outbreak, especially in high tourism areas. The ban on imports of pork has affected producers, and this ban, I think, has been implemented by Russia, Indonesia, and China. And the closure of restaurants in the federal district, the closure of other offices, federal offices, and the closure of schools may mean that some people have had to stay home either to take care of their children or to stay home from work in the service industry, leading to lost income as well. Now, at the social level, with respect to the restaurants, some of the restaurant operators were not happy about the measures that were implemented and gathered at public sites to protest the sort of restriction on takeout food only, feeling that their businesses were being curtailed. Churches have kept their doors open, but have canceled masses in the federal district and in some of the other areas where things, the outbreak has been more serious. With respect to popular culture, there's been a Cumbia de la Influenza, which is going around on YouTube, and I think it features Indiana Jones swooping into some kind of adventure with respect to influenza. I'm not sure what the entire context is. With respect to soccer, I think there was an announcement today that the last 9 matches of the soccer championship are going to be played behind closed doors, so sports events are not going to be open to widespread entertainment. And the Cinco de Mayo reenactment had to be canceled because of, again, this sanitary alert and problems with or concerns over outbreak transmission. I know that Dr. Barbosa is going to talk to a greater extent about the work that PAHO has done in encouraging or assisting countries and encouraging preparedness in the region. But I would just mention, a number of collaborations that have taken place perhaps more at the sub-regional level. The United States, Mexico, and Canada have shared information on the development of their national pandemic preparedness plans and have refined those and exercised them to test them through the Security and Prosperity Partnership that took shape over the past few years. Through the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, Mexico, like other countries on the Pacific Rim of the region, has been involved in influenza pandemic planning exercises along with the United States, Canada, Chile, and Peru, as well as the Asia members or Asia member economies of APEC. In the region, just some of the work that the United States government reports that it has done, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Global Disease Detection Center, which is based in Guatemala, has focused on bolstering regional capacity to undertake disease surveillance. The U.S. Department of Defense has a naval medical research detachment based in Peru, both in Lima and in Iquitos, and has been doing training on influenza surveillance since about 2002. The CDC and Public Health Canada have sent experts to Mexico to assist the government in determining its resource needs and investigating and crafting a response to the outbreak. The World Bank has offered Mexico $205 million to respond to the outbreak and also to evaluate the economic impact. China has also offered Mexico $5 million in technical assistance as well as ongoing support. So there are a number of different mobilizations, both within the region and also at the international level, affecting some of the investigation as well as the outbreak response. I think as of today or yesterday, Mexico had downgraded its alert from red to orange, which means that there's still significant vigilance, but I think people in Mexico City are saying that they're happy that they may be able to get out of the house and sort of get back to social activities again. Restaurants can reopen on Wednesday, but social distancing requirements are in effect, so I think the seats are going to have to be arranged so that people are a little further apart. Theaters may be allowed to reopen, but the seats are going to have to be 6 feet apart, so I guess that might be a challenge if you were going with your friends or your family. Some of the theater operators are saying that they might wait until the outbreak is over. I think, the numbers are always a little hard to keep track of throughout the day, but the last I saw, there had been cases confirmed in 1 in Costa Rica, 2 in El Salvador, and 1 in Colombia, and you may have more updated information. But I think, with the flu season perhaps starting in the southern hemisphere, I know that, there are a number of lessons, to be learned from what has been undertaken with respect to the Mexican response and the North American collaboration with respect to this, and a lot to be learned both about the origins and initial trajectory of the outbreak. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. While he's setting up, I just want to calm your fears about the soccer comment. I saw on the weekend the games are now being they're still being played and they're still being televised. There's just no one in the stadium. It's sort of eerie.
A strange context.
Kind of takes care of the important
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the CSIS for the invitation. I'm here on behalf of the Pan American Health Organization to present the epidemiological situation and the response provided by PAHO. PAHO, I don't know if all you know, we are a double organization because at the same time we belong to the OAS, Organization of the American State System. PAHO was founded in 1902, so we have 107 years now. But at the same time, we are the WHO regional office for the Americas region. Here, I will make a general presentation, and of course, we will have opportunity to discuss some details in the questions and answers. The world is preparing for a pandemic since for the last 5 or 6 years. The precondition for a pandemic is when we have a new virus that previously is an animal virus, that this virus learns to be transmitted from an animal to a human, and after this, it will learn to be transmitted from one human to another human. When we have this situation, the population is totally susceptible to this new virus, so in general it spreads very, very fast, and it produces more severe cases than the common flu virus that we have. We had in the last century, we had at least 3 pandemics of influenza. I say at least because there is one, the fourth one is, there is no technical consensus if it was a pandemic or not, because as we will see in the next slides, pandemic is not a very objective concept. We need to agree about what kind of pandemic we are talking about. But we had the Spanish flu that is very well known, that it was a dramatic pandemic with estimated 20 to 40 million deaths in the whole world. But we had also a pandemic in the 50s and another one in the 60s that produced some extra burden, but it was not perceived as a public health problem in the global the global scenario. For some countries, we had a burden on the health system, but in some countries they didn't perceive any difference in terms of morbidity or mortality vis-a-vis with the flu season common burden they had. The preconditions, if we remember the flu, the bird flu episode that started 5 years ago, we had a virus that was a bird flu virus that learned to transmit, how transmit from birds to human, but we didn't have sustainable transmission from human to another human. If you remember, we had in several countries in Asia some cases, severe cases with a large proportion of deaths among the cases, but we only had cases among people that had direct contact with birds, and occasionally 1 or 2 cases that were transmitted in the same family or in people that live together. Now, I think that all know that we are in the pandemic phase 5. Maybe the Director General of WHO will make a statement this afternoon or tomorrow morning. We are not sure about if we will remain in phase 5 or if we will go to the next phase. But this phase, we are not talking about the severity of the disease. We are talking about the geographic expansion of the disease only. We are in the phase 5 because we have sustained transmission in at least 2 countries in the same region. Now, in this moment, we consider that we have strong evidence to confirm that we have sustainable human-to-human transmission in two countries, Mexico and the U.S. And we have in some countries in Europe, surveillance and epidemiological studies are trying to establish if there is or not sustainable human-to-human transmission. To go to the next phase, we needed to have this evidence that we have sustainable human-to-human transmission at least one country in another region. In this case, Europe, UK, Spain, and the German are the strongest candidates to be this country. So far, majority of the cases seems to be mild. In Mexico, I think that we had the first information from Mexico were not very clear about the severity because the media had a lot of news about the hospitalized cases and deaths. But the problem with Mexico in the next days is that the denominator was so underestimated. The number of cases was so underestimated that I think that included there was a hypothesis that maybe we were dealing with two different serotypes of the same virus, but it's not confirmed so far. There are some research that is going, but the cases in Mexico, what is explaining the main risk factor to explain the severity and deaths in Mexico is the difficult to access health services, is that the treatment were established in the 50th or 6th or 7th day of the disease, and I think that you know that the antiviral is very effective in the first 48 hours. After these 2 days, its effectivity decreases very, very fast. So even in Mexico, we can say now that most of the cases are mild cases, but we are talking about a new virus that is not a stable virus, so we need to monitor its behavior very closely because we cannot make any estimation about the future if it will remain as producing cases in the same manner that it's been producing so far. Here you see the 6 phases that we have that were established by WHO in the guidelines for the pandemic influenza preparedness plans. We were in the phase 3 when we had predominantly animal infections and few human infections. When this new virus was detected, the WHO has an emergency committee that is a mechanism that was established by the new international health regulation. This committee had a discussion and made a recommendation to the Director General to move to the phase 4. And 2 days later, the Director General decided to move to the phase 5. But the main actions, as you can see in this table, they are not very different. In fact, what will change? We will move from a pre-pandemic phase to a pandemic phase. But the main difference will be in the region, in the new region where where we will have the new country with the sustainable transmission, human-to-human transmission established. Because, for example, for the Americas, all the measures that are already implemented by the countries will remain the same in the new phases. So it's important because maybe we will have this announcement by WHO in, I don't know, today, tomorrow, in 2 or 3 days, because it's thing that we are very close to make this announcement, and we are concerned that some newspapers and the media can have the perception that we are saying that the severity is increasing, and it's not true. Here we have it's a map of the region. These figures are changing every day, as you can see. We have this morning we had the 141 cases in Canada. We had the 822 cases in Mexico and 463 cases in the United States. And we had cases confirmed also in El Salvador, 2 cases in Costa Rica and Colombia, 1 case in each country. And this morning we had the confirmation of 1 case in Guatemala. We probably will have tomorrow, I think that more countries confirming cases. We have 2 or 3 probable cases in Belize, for example, that we will have the result tomorrow. And it's not, I think that it's not bad news. I think that this is a sign that the countries are performing the surveillance. The countries are able to detect the cases, and so they are implementing the measure. With all the global connections that we have today, and as Mexico, that is so far is the epicenter of the outbreak, is a country with a large exchange of persons do tourism to business. It's expected that almost every country in this region will have confirmed case in the next days. I think that's not, I will not be surprised if in 1 week or 2 weeks, almost every country in this region will have 2, 3, 5, 10 cases, 10 confirmed cases. This is a map for Europe. In Europe, as you can see, we have the Spain and UK as the countries with the big number of cases. Here we have that figures to the region of Americas. I just want to highlight that Mexico, even this number of 822 cases is underestimation about what happened in Mexico. I believe it's a hypothesis that we are discussing further, but we think that the epidemic in Mexico didn't start 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's not feasible that we can have all this, almost in every state of Mexico we have cases, included we had cases in Europe and the United States that had traveled to Cancun, for example, and the province where is Cancun didn't report confirmed cases until 2 days ago. So maybe we had a combination of 2 or 3 situations that make it very difficult to Mexico to perceive that there was something different going on. The cases were mild. The flu season in Mexico was in the end, so it was perceived in the beginning as a second wave at the end of the flu season in Mexico. So it's not very epidemiologically coherent that in 2 or 3 weeks we have the virus so spread in Mexico as it already is now. But it's only a hypothesis. We need to get more evidence to confirm this. This is the table for Europe. Now, I told you that Spain and United Kingdom and Germany are the strongest candidates to confirm sustainable community transmission. It's not related with the number of the cases, but it's related when we have the second or third generation of transmission. For example, in these 3 countries, this morning we had almost 12 cases that didn't travel to Mexico, but they were direct contact of a person who had traveled to Mexico. So if the epidemiological surveillance in these countries detects that there are cases that didn't have any direct contact with people that travel to Mexico, we can confirm that there is some level of community transmission, and this will be the trigger that WHO will use to go to phase 6. In other regions, we also have some cases in Israel, in China, in Korea, in New Zealand. In China, we had a kind of diplomatic problem because there was a quarantine, and I think that not a voluntary quarantine, that was decided for everyone who came from Mexico, even if he or she didn't have any symptoms. So there was some problem between Mexico and China that I think that can be in a diplomatic and political way. I think that we need to have this thing finished, because China included is providing some support to Mexico that it's very important to the country. This figure is only to show you that now we have a new legal framework among the countries, that is the International Health Regulation. This International Health Regulation was approved in the World Health Assembly 2005. And this is the only legal framework the countries have to make a report about an outbreak or a case of a new disease to the WHO. This was approved in 2005 after all that panic that was produced by the outbreak of SARS. The International Health Regulation, it's not a new mechanism. Indeed, the first one, it was approved in the 50s. But and it was not related to health, but it's related to trade, to tourism, so it's not very easy to make any change in the International Health Regulation. For this reason, the reviewing process of the International Health Regulation started in 1994, and it was being. I think that there was not a lot of interest among the countries to have this new International Health Regulation. But when we had in 2003 the emergence of SARS, the world, I think that there was the perception that the old International Health Regulation was not able to prevent the spread of a new disease, because in fact the countries were obliged to inform only a short list of well-known disease. If there was a new disease as SARS, the country, maybe we could say that the country had an ethical obligation to inform, but legally the country was not has no obligation to inform officially this disease. So the countries decided to speed up the process, and in 2005 we had the new International Health Regulation. There is a lot of changes. I will not go in details, but there are two ones that are very important. The first one that now WHO, we don't need to receive official information from the country. We can use every source that is available, ProMed, rumors, media, so on. For example, the first information about that there was something different happening in the district of Veracruz in Mexico, it came from the 2 or 3 search mechanisms that we have that are 24 hours, 7 days a week, searching the internet, searching for some specific words, and we receive the report, and this report can be used to start the verification process with the country. The other change that is very important that we moved from a list of well-known diseases for 3 situations, that we have a list of diseases that the countries are obliged to notify. We have a list that we need to use an algorithm, because cholera outbreak, for example, it can be a local event or international event. Depends on the capacity or the national capacity to detect and respond to it. And there is a third group of everything that can be an international event of public health concern, a new disease, an old disease, so on. So I think that now the world is more prepared to detect this emergency. What's PAHO doing about this new situation? We are monitoring the regional situation. Every day we receive information from the countries and we exchange information with the other regional offices and with Geneva about the data and about the technical and the scientific information, because this is a new virus, so there is a lot of questions about the severity, about some clinical characteristics that we need to know better about this virus. We are providing some instruments to the countries as diagnosis kits that the collaborating centers to the influenza branch is providing. In our case, this collaborative center is the flu laboratory at the CDC, Atlanta. Since 2004, we are supporting countries to prepare their national plan. In every country in this region, they have their national prepared plans to the pandemic, but they are different. I think that in some countries these plans were reviewed. They have a very strong technical background, and the Ministry of Health established, using this plan as a platform to establish some partnership with other stakeholders that are very important in the detection and response to a pandemic. But in other countries, we think that the level of readiness is not the same. We have around 27 experts in Mexico in different fields that are working with the national authorities to respond to the emergency, and we have an emergency operations center that is working 24 hours, 7 days since April 23rd. We also convened two teleconferences with Minister of Health. One was yesterday. This is very important to share information and to support the countries to make some decisions about the public health measures. In some countries in this region, in the small islands, in the Caribbean region, for example, where tourism is a very important source for the economy in these islands, and they don't have, in some of the islands, they don't have an epidemiology unit that can discuss with the minister what are the measures that need to be implemented with the evidence that we have. So this teleconference we will have twice a week. The next one will be Friday, and we had the 26 ministers that participate in the last one. WHO Geneva is leading the global scientific community to increase knowledge. As I told you, for example, this morning we had a teleconference. 6 countries presented their epidemiological data, the laboratory data, because we need to have this kind of exchange and sharing this information with the scientific community. The WHO is also taking decisions on public health events of international concern, the pandemic phase and the recommendations, and is mobilizing additional resources. We are having a lot of conversation with USAID, CIDA Canada, the World Bank, the IDB, in order to establish additional resources to support the countries to respond to this situation. About the antivirus, also PAHO is deploying our own strategic stockpile that we had, and we also received for the poorest 6 countries in the region donation from the global stockpile from WHO. So every country in this region we will have access to oseltamivir in order to provide treatment to the face cases and also to use the oseltamivir to make the containment measures that are needed to the close contacts. And we also are using the procurement mechanism that we have that's called the strategic fund to purchase antivirals to the countries that have funds to buy them. About vaccines, you know that the WHO didn't decide to stop the production of the seasonal vaccine flu because we cannot produce the both vaccines at the same time. If the epidemiological situation, the analysis of the epidemiological situation will inform when WHO needs to say stop the production of the seasonal vaccine and start to produce the pandemic vaccine. Why this decision wasn't made yet? Because the severity of the cases, we need to study more, but the severity of the cases now, they are not bigger than the severity that is expected to the flu, the seasonal flu. I don't know if you know, but we probably have around 500,000 deaths every year related to influenza. So to make a decision that we will not have the seasonal influenza vaccine, we need to have good evidence that this trade-off will be a good decision to prevent death. But the first steps of this production have already started. We have 5 collaborative centers in the world. They are working on this virus. They are preparing the seed lots that will be deployed to the producers until the end of this month. So if the decision needs to be made to shift the vaccine, the first phases will be already be performed by the producers. Well, the member states' response, we think that the countries are better prepared than 5 years ago, doing all this, the training, the laboratory support, the drills, the simulations. So and we have a lot of information from the countries that every countries they activated their emergency center or the emergency committee that was in the plan, and in these plans they have the several different actions and measures that they have to implement related to each phase that we have. The travel recommendations, WHO is not recommending any restrictions on travel and no border closings. It's not, as I was informed, some countries are suspending flights to Mexico, as Argentina and Cuba. This morning, the Minister of Health of Argentina informed us that they are reviewing. We don't believe that it will work because, for example, we had 2 days ago one case, one woman from Buenos Aires that she was in Mexico, and she came from Mexico to California, and she flight from California to Buenos Aires. And she was sick in the plane, and the plane made a stop at Lima, Peru, and it was confirmed in the first 2 hours as a confirmed case. After the laboratory exams, it was not the X swine flu, but it was the old H1N1. But this situation, I think that it was very clear that you cannot, now you can live in Mexico City and take a flight to Paris and take a plane from Paris to Buenos Aires, and I think that it's not the case to suspend flights. There are some countries that are, as U.S., that are recommending that travels that you can suspend you should suspend. I think that this is more, probably I think that it's more acceptable. The recommendation is that the people who are ill should delay travel, and all the travelers from everywhere needs to receive the information. If they present any symptoms of respiratory disease, they need to go to a medical, to seek for medical advice immediately. The individual recommendation, we need to have a case-by-case study. We cannot make the same recommendation from Mexico, where we have a very high level of community transmission. We cannot make the same recommendation for a country that is detecting the first case in a traveler. But we know that there are some general information to be aware, get information, wash hands. This is the most important measure. It works better than masks, for example. Masks are good for pictures and for newspapers, but indeed they don't protect people, because they are these masks that you can buy in a drugstore. They don't have the capacity to avoid the virus to come in, and after 2 or 3 hours that you are using, the humidity of your breath, the mask. There are some studies that prove that the mask will be a risk factor, and it's not recommended that for general use. Some people that have a relative in the same house that is sick needs to use a mask under the medical orientation to exchange the mask after 3 or 4 years. And people that have symptoms, maybe these are the ones that need to use mask, as the Japanese use. I think that this is a good maybe these are good advice that we can have about masks. But in general, for universal use, masks are not recommended. Also, the agriculture, the Minister of Agriculture have some concern about the trade and the industry related with pork. So far we don't have any information about epizootics. We had only, I think that last Saturday we received the information about. It's a very not common case. A farmer work probably transmitted the virus to a pig. So in this case, the humans were a danger to the pigs, but it was only the unique case in Mexico. So far, we don't have any information about epizootics or deaths among pigs. So it's not any kind of recommendation about avoiding eating pork. It's the last one for update information. We have on the website of PAHO and on the website of WHO, we have also this America's Interactive Atlas that is being updated every 2 hours, because every 2 hours we are receiving new information. But as I mentioned in the beginning, I think that the number of the cases in the countries is not the more important, because it will increase. It's expected that it will increase in the next days. And I think the most important information is about the behavior of the virus. What will happen with the virus? How we can predict about the severity that it will present in the next days. I think that this is the main information that we need now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine and Jarvis. I'd like to kick off the Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, please wait for a microphone to come around to you and let us know who you are. Who'd like to get started? Andrew.
guess two questions. I mean, maybe one for each of you or for both of you. One is, what is the chance that this may come back in a more virulent way? I mean, is this a realistic concern? Do we have any way of knowing this? Was history tell us anything about this? And secondly, and maybe this is for Catherine, but there's been a lot of meetings in the Security and Prosperity Partnership among health officials from Mexico, Canada, and the United States over the past few years. Did that help in create the pathways for a quick response among the three countries that seem to be the most affected so far?
Okay, that's a very good question. The flu season in the North Hemisphere is finished, but the flu season in the South Hemisphere will start in June. So we have a lot of concern about what will be the behavior of the virus in the flu season, because we can have a double burn on the health service, because they will need to lead. They will need to handle with the cases from the seasonal flu and this new virus. And there is also the opportunity for a co-infection in the same person, and the virus can exchange some genetic material, and maybe there is some possibility that it can happen a new mutation on the virus. So for this reason, we are strongly recommending that all the countries in the region need to use the seasonal vaccine. The 80 countries that they don't have the vaccine yet, we are providing through donation because they need to use this vaccine this month because the vaccine needs to be the people need to get the vaccine now to be to have defense, to have immunity defense in June and July. But we need to monitor very closely this behavior.
Good job.
Sure. On the Security and Prosperity Partnership, I think since about the summer of 2006 or when that began to get started, there was discussion about health and cooperation between the United States, Mexico, and Canada on the security side and on the prosperity side, looking at issues related to public health emergency preparedness, disaster response, working out possibilities for mutual assistance among the different participating countries, and also personnel exchange, familiarizing personnel from the various health agencies with practices and just with people and collaboration, doing a rotation in one country or another. So, and then more recently, I think over the past couple of years, there was an intense focus on pandemic preparedness, and that brought many of those different strains into play. So, I have heard people in recent days saying that yes, they do think that this level of cooperation that was built up over the previous few years within the Security and Prosperity Partnership process, along with some of the other activities like the APEC pandemic preparedness and other bilateral processes, have familiarized people in the region, personnel with their counterparts in other countries, and also just paved the way for a set of communications that may have facilitated some work in this case.
I have a quick question. What it seems to me that the cooperation between countries and with international organizations has been pretty good. Is there, but what sort of a score would you give the international community in terms of this response? Is it falling in line with everything we learned from avian flu and from SARS and some of that work, or there's still some lessons to be learned and still improvement to be made?
I believe that we had a lot of progress from the first wave of pandemic concerns in the world, because at that time I remember that there was the problem was that in no country, I think that we need to have this concept very clear. No country is safety if the world is not a safety place. Because, for example, there was a lot of debate about the oseltamivir and access to vaccine and so on. Even if you have 100 million of treatment of oseltamivir in the U.S., but if you have a lot of transmission in the other countries in Latin America, Central America, in Caribbean, it's impossible to detect case by case when they arrive. And I think that this is more true yet now with these mild cases, that how you can detect them. So I think that there was a lot of improvement in the technical cooperation, and for example, the developed countries now are offering experts, oseltamivir, funds to support the other countries. I think that this kind of global cooperation is very I think that a very important piece of the response. And I think that there is also, I think, that a better understanding by the Ministry of Health that the aim of the surveillance in this case of most of the new disease that you have is not to avoid them to arrive in a country. I think that this was in the past, but now is okay. Try to avoid at the airports and at the ports, but it's not sufficient, because the real border that you have nowadays is the emergency rooms in the hospital. Because for example, there are some countries that they have thermal screenings in the airport. It's good for the news, for I don't know, the minister will announce, but Canada has a good experience with thermal scanners. They use to try to detect the SARS case, and they performed more than 1 million scan exams at the airport. The 5 imported cases of SARS that brought the SARS outbreak to Canada, they were not detected at the airport, because nowadays you can travel 3 or 4 times around the world during the incubation period. So you arrive with no fever, with no symptoms, and will be, even if there is a medical exam or a thermal scanner, it will not detect that you arrive. So I think that this kind of new conception about surveillance and containment, I think that it's helping a more strong cooperation among the countries.
Question in the back.
Sure. Ryan Moore with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Research Service. A question, there's a lot of talk about collaboration. Do you see any gaps or needs for work between the agriculture community and the public health community, and what some of those gaps might be, now that the virus is out of the barn per se, but maybe looking down the road a couple of years, what the gaps in research or knowledge might be?
Yes, I believe that despite all the progress that we made in the last years, if we know that almost 7% of the new emerging diseases that were detected in the last 40 years are zoonotic, yes, I'm tired. Are zoonotic, I think that we need to strengthen this collaboration between agriculture and health sector. I think that the flu bird was for many countries in the world, was the first time that the surveillance system, the Ministry of Health surveillance system and the agriculture surveillance system had some kind of conversation to establish standards, to have some channel of communication. So I think that that we need to improve, because since the international health regulation entered into force, we had this year, last year in this region, 57 public health events of international concern, And I think that 8 or 9% of these events were related with products, food, and there was implication related to trade, to agriculture. In the world that you have today, the sanitary barriers are the most acceptable barriers that a country can raise. So when we had a problem with the jalapeno contamination in Mexico, the Mexico authorities say, no, there is no problem, this barrier that another country is raising. So we need to have this platform to discuss standards, how we can make the verification process in a very transparent way to avoid any kind of use of these measures to establish barriers to the commerce. But yes, I think that there are some gaps in the countries and in the international scenario, because we have some discussion with the OIE. OIE is the World Animal Health Organization and the FAO, but we need to work, I think, that better in the countries and in the international organization that belongs to the UN system.
And up here in the front.
Good afternoon. I know we have two think tanks represented today, but I'd just like to make a quick quote from the Center for Global Development. There was a blog yesterday by Amit Over, and just a quote from it very quickly. To prepare for the next time, the U.S. together with an international community should, number one, sustain international cooperation on surveillance. Number two, expand surveillance effort to all infectious diseases. 3, learn from Mexico's current difficulties. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Do you want to take a shot at that?
Okay, sure. I didn't write all of those down, but bolster surveillance, continue international collaboration, and learn from Mexico's present situation. Was that?
And expand to all infectious diseases.
Expand to all infectious diseases. I mean, I think I'll confine my comments to the last part. I mean, certainly the maintenance of disease surveillance is of utmost importance, as Dr. Barbosa has explained. I mean, just through the international health regulations and bolstered capacity there. Learning, I think my understanding is that efforts to understand the timeline of the outbreak and, where it started, when it started, how it may have been transmitted are ongoing. And as that timeline is developed and as the information is made available, sort of as a, I don't know, after action report is not the right word, but, sort of a historical analysis of what has taken place and how the international community has worked together, what's worked well, what hasn't, will be, I think, useful either in the current context or in, other kinds of outbreaks.
I agree, and I think that the international health regulation is a very appropriate framework to perform this comprehensive surveillance on not only the infectious disease, but every event, for every event that can be a threat for the international public health. This new international health regulation, we will have until 2012 to establish the core capacities in every country in the world. In the Americas, we are finishing the self-assessment of the core capacities in each country, but we know that we have a lot of needs on laboratory capacity, on rapid response teams, on communications among the national level and subnational level. I think that we will have a very comprehensive agenda to discuss with governments and donors to establish a platform to support the countries with resources and with technical cooperation to have all the core capacities in place.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that I think that PAHO's work and work of a lot of other international organizations and increasingly NGOs is focused on enabling health systems and strengthening health systems, whether it's their workforces or their laboratories or what have you. And I think I read that article, although briefly this morning, by Mead Over. It seemed to me that it was really arguing for strong health systems that are able to catch diseases early on and report out effectively to their populations. Yeah, I saw a hand right back there, I think.
Hi, my name is Laura Keith. I'm from the Homeland Security Policy Institute at George Washington University. And my question is really in regards to the role of security officials here in the U.S. in this kind of public health crisis. And you've spoken highly of the SPP with Canada and the collaboration there. What is your assessment of how U.S. security officials are dealing with the current situation? And then also, particular to Mexico, do Mexican officials see this as a national security situation, and how do they figure national security into this public health crisis? Thank you.
With respect to security here in the United States, I mean, my understanding is that it was the Homeland Security Secretary that declared the public health emergency, a week or so ago, which was basically to authorize or in large part to authorize the transfer of medicines to states that had confirmed cases. I understand that Customs and Border Patrol officials have been, working at ports of entry to, maintain sort of vigilance on people coming into the country to, assess their, whether they're in need of greater medical attention. In terms of, the discussion in Mexico, I might defer to some others around the table who study the security situation in Mexico more concretely. But I understand that in the Congress, at least, there have been discussions about, whether there needs to be, sort of an agency, looking, sort of at these kinds of threats as part of a larger national security discussion. But I might defer to some of my colleagues around the table who focus specifically on security issues there. I don't know if anyone wants to.
Is someone being volunteered here?
I cannot speak for the Mexican government, nor would I pretend to, but I think from what I've seen, there was actually a meeting of the National Security Council in Mexico on this, but primarily it's been dealt with as a health issue, but it's been dealt with, I mean, my analysis as an outside observer is it's been dealt with fairly energetically. As soon as this became evident that this was a potential epidemic, I mean, it took very strong measures in trying to close schools, trying to close businesses, at least in the center of the country, in Mexico City and in the area around Mexico City where this was the most extensive, and schools throughout the country, which some people might have seen as excessive, but actually seems to have detained the epidemic proportions of this. And so it's been a fairly energetic response once the situation was identified. I don't know whether it's going to figure into future discussions on national security, but certainly on public health and on security in the broader sense. But correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone wants to. Is that fair? And there's been actually very good collaboration. I mean, I'm not sure how public this is. I think there's been, I think we could say conversations at the highest level between the Mexican and U.S. governments ongoing on this. Yeah, very rapid response on both sides. And the fact that President Obama has just been in Mexico meeting with President Calderon, the fact that Janet Napolitano was in Mexico meeting with their counterparts and a series of other cabinet secretaries, and therefore all of the people that work for them as well, means that there's a lot of relationships built up there. So they've been able to pick up the phone on various different levels of the government, from, the lowest level to the highest level, and actually have conversations about this.
From a public health perspective, I fully agree that government of Mexico is providing a very strong response. It's at the very, very high level. The decisions the president himself is involved in, and they adopted some measures that are very hard to implement. Closing school, closing workplace, closing restaurants, it's not very easy, and I think that they had a very strong social and political support, and it was very important to make these measures working.
Question way in the back.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Ortiz. I'm representing Lynx Media. We are a health communications firm that specializes in technical assistance and support for the Latin American and Caribbean regions. We've worked alongside USAID as well as USP and PAHO in some of our initiatives. And I had a question kind of a little on a different scale from some of the others, but regarding to spread and response. As far as communications methods, especially with the proliferation of internet and social networking sites, what is your opinion on the creation of toolkits and other media methods that people are starting to create for the assistance for the people of the several different countries? Things are being created in several different languages or multiple languages. Do you think this is an effective approach to help stop the spreading, to help, give more information at a quicker pace? Do you think that this is something that can be kind of, I guess, an overall tool for health communications in general when it comes to emergency or crisis situations globally?
So you're asking specifically about the use of toolkits. Do I understand that correctly?
Specifically or generally?
Sorry.
In any way, I think just in the health communications department, there's been more and more organizations that are starting to create this idea of a toolkit, or this idea of some sort of this, not a product, but a venue that people can go to find, and almost it would have links to PAHO's website or CDC's website. It would give all these rules and ideas of what can be done or what should be done concerning an emergency outbreak.
I mean, it seems to me that, it can certainly be useful. I know there's been a lot of ongoing work, on the avian influenza questions, on pandemic influenza, and other kinds of issues in terms of trying to get the message right, trying to pitch messages at different levels, from, the person in their household, all the way up to sort of government levels. It seems to me that it's also helpful to consider the context in which those messages are being received. And I guess that's where, on the one hand, having toolkits in different languages would strike me, not being a communications specialist, but strike me as being a very useful start, but also, taking into account, the ways in which people, think about their own health, how, people make decisions about when they're going to seek treatment or not, how gender dynamics within the household play into that. I think there are a lot of other things that may be somewhat specific to particular contexts. So I'll leave it at that.
Back there in the corner.
Just to follow up on her question, I was wondering if you see any gaps in communication to reach out to people about the health risks, or what kinds of ways that they can seek out help or seek out immunizations or whatever.
And actually, if I could just jump in to sort of add a third question, but I think it sort of sums them up, is it seems like there's whether it's internet or TV or radio or whatever, there's a ton of information about this out. How do you make sure that that people are getting the right information through all this noise?
Do you want to make any comment first?
Well,
I wish I had the answer to that, but I'm just asking.
Just speaking of television, I did read, and this is, I haven't heard whether in the soap operas flu has been incorporated as an actual theme. You know, I mean, the soap operas around family planning in Mexico are famous from the 1970s for really, you know, getting that issue as an element of discussion. But I have read that with respect to television and popular entertainment, you know, that they've had to do some re-scripting around the romantic scenes in some of the telenovelas, that, you know, physical, you know, with social distancing that is happening in, you know, in restaurants or in other, you know, kinds of venues where people are needing to be more further spaced apart, that has involved some rethinking of some of the plots. So that's obviously just one example, but anyway, I would just in terms of television throw that up.
In the guidelines to the National Preparedness Plan, the risk communication is a very important component, because I think that for both dimensions, the first one is that sometimes the media is more. Sometimes no, I think that every time the media, they don't have all the concerns, the technical and scientific concerns that the Ministry of Health has. So it's good for in some sense, because in last year almost 60% of the events that we considered as public health international concern, we got them from the media, not from the government, because it's not that the governments don't want to make the notification, but in general the governments, they don't like to tell WHO and PAHO, I have an outbreak of a disease that I don't know what is going on, and please help me. This is politically, this is a tragedy in the country. It's different. It's totally different when there is a hurricane or an earthquake. The doors are open to the international community. The Ministry of Health, in general, they only want to communicate when they have all the verifications process finished. And I think that this is a paradigm that this will not change in the future. For this reason, the International Health Regulation supports the use not to have as a notification, but to start the verification process, rumors, internet, media, newspaper, ProMed, every source that we can use. And it is also important, the other dimension, that is to provide technical information well supported on scientific evidence to the people, because I think that in the last outbreaks that we had, in this, not in this one, but the yellow fever, dengue fever in last year, we had some very important cases that when the Ministry of Health is saying one thing and the actions are showing a totally different things, and people now, they are not only listening the statement of the minister, they are watching the images of what's going on. So when we had that outbreak of yellow fever in Paraguay, and the president of Paraguay at that time made a statement, there is no problem about travels to Asunción. But on CNN, we could see at that time that people were fighting to get the vaccine in the streets. So there is a totally different situation, that the statement and what was going on. So I think that it is increasing the understanding in the Ministry of Health that the social communication branch in the Ministry of Health is not only for political purposes, but the communication is a very important tool to ensure prevention and control of disease, because people will seek what's better for their health, and if they the perception is that there is something incoherent between what are the scientific people saying, what are the specialists saying, and what are the measures that are being proposed. I think that we will have a social disagreement that will not support any measure that the Ministry of Health will ask people to do. So I think that communication now it's not only the transparency. The transparency is important, but only what is the message. That the message needs to be very clear. You need to have a source that that will bring information based on evidence and so on. And we have always a problem in this situation, in situations like this, because the human being is not very comfortable with uncertain development of the situation. So I think that the most common question is, what is the forecast about the virus? What will happen next month? It will have more severe cases. And it's not very easy to say the truth, that we cannot predict some things that will happen. We cannot use the behavior so far to say that we can have 100%, we are 100% confident that this behavior will remain the same in the next 6 months. So for this reason, I think that this communication needs to be very well discussed with the technical specialists, but also in communication specialists to have the correct message to the people.
Okay, I think we've got a great range of questions, and we had two very expansive presentations. So I think we're going to wrap up here. Please join me in thanking our speakers.